Congratulations on Stable Arts, everybody. This is an amazing achievement here in DC, and I've been around long enough to know just how difficult it is to pull something like this off. So kudos to that, and if you all aren't already supporters, you should be. We're going to speak today with these fine people, who I'll introduce shortly. But I wanted to sort of frame what we're going to talk about a little bit. We want to talk about, discuss the nature of language as it appears in contemporary art. We want to look at symbols and language systems, and the visual and creative practices through which they interact. So I think in all these cases, we're going to see some of that. We want to look at how meaning and significance are constructed in relation to, or even in opposition to, everyday language and our own interior monologues. And maybe towards the end we can talk a little bit about technology and sort of the impacts that technology is beginning to have on language. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself first. I'm Don Russell. I'm the University Curator at George Mason University, where I've been for 8 years. Prior to that, I had started an organization in DC called Provisions Library. Maybe some of you were able to visit us when we were in DuPont Circle. But it was proving to be too difficult to sort of survive the organization in DC, so we began a partnership with George Mason, and we relocated the entire library into the School of Art out there, where we introduce students to research methods and sort of looking at the relationship of art to contemporary society. So I'd like to just have the panelists talk very briefly about their backgrounds and maybe just a brief scope of the type of work that you are making. Does that all make sense? Did I leave anything out? Okay, good. This is Molly Springfield.
That means I'm going first.
Yes, you are. You're recording.
Might use the microphone, just so I don't have to strain my voice. Does everyone hear me okay?
Perfect.
So hi, I'm Molly Springfield. I'm a stable artist. My work in the show here are the 2 drawings in the corner over there. And I make graphite drawings of photocopies of printed texts. And very broadly, I'm interested in the histories of technologies of reproduction, of information, and how moments within that history has changed how people experience and consume language. So in varying degrees, all of my projects kind of get at that big question, and I tend to build projects up around specific bodies of research over a period of years. And my current project, which these drawings are a part of, I use a holograph draft of Virginia Woolf's novel To the Lighthouse as their main source material.
Could you say a little bit about your background and how you came to the arts?
I guess I was always an artist to some degree. I always wanted to be one. There's, usually another thing on that list that I thought I might want to be, like an astronaut or, but an artist was always on that list. And I eventually committed to that. And I studied studio art within a liberal arts context as an undergraduate. So I went to liberal arts school and majored in studio art. So my background as an artist, I think, is really influenced by the other kinds of disciplines and classes that you have to take as a liberal arts student. I think that, looking back, I think that really is formative in the kind of work that I make and how I make it. And then I went to the post-baccalaureate program at Maryland Institute College of Art, so I had a little art school experience, and then I worked and lived here in DC for a couple years, and then I went to grad school at UC Berkeley. So again, I was in a kind of broader university context, which I think also really influenced how I ended up making the work I make today.
What were you studying at UC Berkeley?
I got my MFA there,
MFA.
and they call the department the art practice department. We don't go in as a specific discipline, and then you're also able to take courses within the university as a whole, so that really appealed to me as well.
Thank you. And next we have Ying Zhu.
Can you hear me okay?
You want to use, there's a mic if you want to use it.
So my name is Ying. I was born and raised in China. I moved from Beijing to Omaha, Nebraska about 20 years ago. So my undergrad background was actually in computer science. When I first moved to America, I didn't really know what to do or what to study. And then I had some friends, Chinese friends, who recommended that you're Chinese, you probably shouldn't be too bad at math. So I did computer science. And then towards the end of it, I just realized that, how much I did not like it, and I didn't want anything to do with it, but I didn't know what else to do, so I just finished it. And then I took a year off and tried to really figure out what I wanted to do. And I started taking some studio classes, and I have never studied or paid more attention. So I felt really lucky that I figured, what I'm really passionate about. So I applied for grad school. I got my MFA in sculpture. So most of my work are installation based. So you can see my piece in the show is in this corner, the little black letters that were glued directly onto the wall. So most of my work are site sensitive. And then because I didn't really have art background in undergrad, so I tend to look for unconventional, non-traditional materials or ways or processes, just because for one, I didn't really know. I wasn't properly trained or had this strong background to woodworking or metal work. So I kind of just find my ways about and around. And then with language, I think my work is really a reflection of my own experiences, how I approach, how I learned English as a second language as an adult, and then how that has, just my life experiences, and try to fit in, try to maneuver, and try to navigate, through art, and then the expressive power of visual languages and the literal meanings of languages. So, yeah.
Thank you. Lorraine Graham.
I'm Lorraine Graham. I went to school here in DC at GW, and I was an East Asian Studies and Chinese language major. I did that because I thought I wanted to be a journalist, which is like a practical way of becoming a writer, right? And someone said, well, if you want to be a journalist and work overseas, you should study another language. And I'd already studied French and Spanish, so I thought, okay, I'll study Chinese. So for a long time, the plan was to work in public policy. And I did after I graduated, but in the meantime, a friend of mine was taking poetry classes and was going to readings here in DC and said, come on, Lorraine, come with me, I know you write. And I did. And it was really exciting to discover that poets were people who actually existed and weren't dead. And it's like, yeah. Saying you're a poet is like telling someone you're a hero. I'm a poet, like Homer. And the group of writers that I sort of fell in with here in Washington, D.C., they actually hosted readings at the old Washington Printmakers Gallery. They were very connected with the Corcoran College of Art and Design when it was still place. So already I was in an artistic community, mostly writers, but that was really interacting with the biz arts community. And that influenced my approach to writing. So a lot of my work is either very loosely research oriented or process based. So for example, for my second book, I had a couple of rules, which was that I had to write on my bus commute, and I had to write until I was too nauseous to continue. And if there was only even one person in the bus, I had to sit next to them. I always had to sit next to somebody on the bus. So the process of writing, there's sort of mini performances, and then the poems are the documentation. And then sometimes there's augmented research.
Great, perfect. I will start asking some questions now, and then we'll have some time for you all to do that as well. I'd like to say to Ying, you talked about the process of learning a second language, and there's a profound difference between Chinese and English. And if you could sort of walk us through how your artwork played a role in this, or perhaps was influenced by the process of learning the English language and how different it is from Chinese.
Chinese is very pictorial, so actually some of the characters literally looks like what it's describing. And then, as children learning a new language, we mimic the sound of it. We may not, we try not to, or we are not able to look at it and recognize it. But then, as an adult, when you approach a new language or you learn a new language, you're consciously trying to make sense of it, trying to recognize it and intellectually interpret it, and then trying to make connections. But then, as a grown-up learning a new language, and then, because looking at Chinese characters throughout all these years, when I see something, before I know what it meant, I first see the shapes and I see the forms of it. So, my approach of, to English, I was really just, I knew the meaning of some of it, but then I was just trying to emphasize on how to express, artistically, and then kind of transform and transcend the literal meaning, and then present it in a different way for viewers to sort of experience my experience. When you see the piece on the wall, it's made of letter A's, but then you can't really read it, but then you perceive it as a visual form of, expression, and you kind of see other things, and you make references of, birds flying, spider webs. So it's just, taking language out of its contextual or literal context, and then give it a new outfit. And then, at the same time, I felt like when you speak a different language other than your own, you take on this different personality where you express yourself differently as well. So, when I speak Chinese, my hands are always here. And when I speak English, I don't know why, it's just like...
Don't you know what I mean?
Yeah, it keeps it flowing, you got it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Also, your work is sculptural, actually, even though it's low relief in some sense. But to me, I also got a sense that you had conquered English in a sense by being able to take the letter forms and play with them and make your own meanings out of them. So that's just a comment more than anything. But I know it was a frustrating process, so I did sense a bit of triumph, through your art with language. Good. Molly, let's see here. We've talked a lot about research, and we're going to continue, but if you could talk about how you make choices in selecting the elements that go into your work. What do you look for when you're leafing through a book and you see, you tell us.
I think because we only have the 2 visual examples that are in the gallery, I'll stick to that so we have a visual reference. So those 2 drawings are based on photocopies that I made from the holograph draft of Virginia Woolf's novel To the Lighthouse. And
Can you explain?
Yes. A holograph draft is the typed version of the author's original handwritten manuscript. So it doesn't change anything about the text. It preserves the actual language that's in that first draft so that it can be readable for scholars. And then it retains her marginalia and kind of editing marks in a place on the page that they were on her handwritten manuscript. So in the drawings, the kind of vertical poem that I've written from the photocopies occurs in the book because they've preserved the marginalia that she wrote in the margin of the page. So one way I go about making drawings is looking at the form of the book I'm working with. So the text is very integral to the form that it's on, whether it's on a book or in a Word document, and that will determine to some degree how the drawings are made. So the holograph draft appealed to me for a lot of reasons. I have an interest in marginalia. I have a whole other project that's about marginalia. And over the last few years, my work, I've come to think of it as being original pieces of writing that are just experienced visually. And the holograph draft kind of gave me this vertical format, like poems are usually vertical. So I was able to go through the holograph draft and select pages where there were fragments that sounded interesting. I make a lot of photocopies, so I went through the book, I made photocopies of many pages, and then I went back to the studio and started putting photocopies together, reading the fragments that I photocopied. I think of that process as the writing process. It's when I write what will eventually become the drawing. So a lot of photocopies get made, a lot of photocopies don't get used, but through that process, I wind up at what you see there on the wall.
But in addition, I've noticed, not here but upstairs when we were in your studio, that you're also finding imagery from photographs of books and albums and such, and you're sort of treating them in a similar way through exact copying of those things. Is there is that something that you were always doing, or did you kind of break through into that? Because it seems like your process was very kind of word-based. And then
I've always been a representational artist, so I was trained as a very traditional painter. When I went into graduate school, I was making trompe l'oeil paintings of like my mail or other like matchbooks, like very kind of 19th century Piteau, Harnack kind of stuff. So this idea of reproduction was always there in the work. And then in graduate school, I took a course in late 20th century art, and one of our texts was Lucy Lepard's book, 6 Years, Dematerialization of the Art Object, 1966 to 1972. And it's essentially an annotated bibliography of all the conceptual art practices that were happening during those years. And it really changed the way I thought about how work was made and what it could be made about, especially conceptual artists who were mainly text-based. Because a lot of the things I was painting had text on them, like the mail, the printed labels on the objects, and I was always really interested in the material qualities of that text and didn't really think too much about what it said. And so that exposure and studying of conceptual art shifted my frame of reference to
artist language.
yes,
perhaps?
artist like yes. When text is in a visual artwork, it has visual formal qualities the same as any object, like whether it's a apple on a table, it has material qualities that are visual, but it also can convey information.
Right.
So one thing I like to try to do in my drawings is that the drawing is a visual object, but it can also tell you about itself.
Mm-hmm.
If you can read it as a text, or you can see it as an object, and you can go back and forth between those two experiences.
Got it. Great.
Does that answer?
Definitely, that's good. Thank you. I was thinking, Lorraine, why don't we have you read something because these guys have some work on the wall, and we want to see what your poetry sounds like.
I have an augmented version of this book, of the first edition of it. Oh no, where, I was in California when I wrote this. The year what sentences can hold, fill, draglines, marine sanctuaries, dolphins, salt seaweed, the ocean, can't get out of bed, later greet everyone during the AM walk, mollified whistling, bless you, until it's a swear. The form isn't working. Next month he turns 88, when there's no public life to be separate from, how the sky becomes the ocean through the cloud. War makes military personnel throw up. Pregnancy makes many women throw up. Even humanitarian operations can induce chronic nausea. He's missing a leg, going to the hospital where the food, he says, is not very good. Smell of soaked over labor, exhaustion. Egypt killed all the pigs a few months ago. I remember the story. Quote, there was no scientific basis for it, unquote. We're going by a building called the Plaza Building, and I want to say something about it. Instead, how's your fantasy team doing? Coverage is good. Is your wingman okay? An F-4 flies overhead and drops a sonic boom on us. We have the F-16. It's rocket assisted, he says. Imagine what it does to your eyeballs. Who is dispersed? B-52. We need to extend. Stand. He's a psychologist now getting residual checks from Universal Studios. He has an office near the grocery store. It's nice, but he's got to listen to people's problems. He says, I heard on the radio that San Diego is the 5th most stressed city in our nation after Chicago, Houston, Boston, and LA. I want to kiss your post-traumatic stress disorder, then our avatars can go for a jog. On-screen action powered by a human behind the screen, breathing in a slow, relaxed way. I love my girlfriend. We have long-term plans, houses, dreams. But is disdain for Celine Dion innate or learned? Is her ululatory arm-flinging truly unforgivable? I love you because I imagine other people find you beautiful. To be aware of it all but not look, as long as life seems to be working, the embedded features of life are working.
Nice, thank you. There seems to be a lot of connection to the visual. I mean, I guess that's true of all words. Or almost like a film.
Mm-hmm.
It's very sequential and sort of narrative in a funny way. What do you think about that?
Yes, actually, I think my work, it's funny, no one's ever called it filmic, but I think that that's apt. I'm definitely interested in mini narratives and mini anecdotes, because a lot of what I write is the result of me sitting in some kind of a public space and not necessarily at a desk. What I'm doing is I'm interacting with people, either in conversation or just watching them or I'm eavesdropping on them. So I'm having conversations, I'm watching mini narratives unfold, again, in public spaces, and then I'm just seeing things and writing them down.
Yeah, it's observational.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not. Well, how do you stand in relation to like more literary traditions? Do you see this? Like, what's the break away from literary tradition into more like this for you?
There's definitely a tradition of writing and poetry, and in the U.S. around the world that's non-narrative or that's narrative in a non-traditional way, right? So that might be more fragmented. Like I'm trying to think of more contemporary examples of this. It's like Bolaño, right? Which a lot of you have probably read. Bolaño definitely writes stories, but a lot of them are not necessarily linear. Right? Like by now, we're actually pretty accustomed to reading things that are 100% linear, and in films, we're used to dealing with things that are not necessarily linear all of the time. In language, it can be a little bit more jarring. But there's a poet who is very important to me, like we talked about the other day, Bernadette Mayer, who's one example of a writer in this particular kind of poetic tradition where that intersects very heavily with the visual arts and visual art practices. And so she does a lot of things like she'll keep a journal of her commute. In fact, this book was basically like, all right, I'll just do the Bernadette Mayer thing where I keep a journal of my commute, right? That's one way that it started. Or lists of things, or that's a gathering, right, of language-based information. Just the same way that you might gather objects, figure out what to do with them, gather eggshells, right?
Now, how do you organize? I mean, yes, the commute has its own inherent organization to it, but you do other processes as well. And how do you organize your research, I guess?
Yeah, I actually have a lot of angst about that. I mean, at a certain point as a writer, you're expected to publish a book, and so somebody makes you organize it. In my fantasy universe, the book is like the book version of it, and then maybe there are other versions. So I frequently, I change the order of things when I read a lot, so I don't read things in the same order all of the time. So actually, I feel like this book could be like 5 or 6 books in different order. I guess the short answer is that the rhetorical situation structures how I order something. So, if it's a reading, that's one particular situation. And if it's a book from a particular publisher, it's another.
Cool. And sort of reminded me that like there were periods of time in art history when like poetry and everybody was like in the same room together, the cafe or whatever. And I wonder how we can make that. I mean, you can't force those things into happening, but do you have any sense that there's the components nowadays for that kind of crossover to take place?
No, I mean, that's one thing that really excited me about Stable. And when I was in California, right, so to certify I was in DC, then I left and went to California, and then I came back to DC. But when I was in California, I was able to sort of really engage with a community of writers and artists that were intersecting in interesting ways. And then I did an MFA in writing at UC San Diego, which was also a program that was extremely interdisciplinary. I took classes in the Viz Arts department. There were Viz Arts students in writing classes. I took 3/4 of classes with the MFA theater students and learned how to stand on someone's shoulders and juggle. And they were just like, do whatever you want. And that's really unusual. Usually in writing, you're segregated by genre. You won't even be in a class with somebody who writes a genre other than you, which is absurd. So I think there are moments when that happens, and it's like some combination of institutional spaces that support that, and then also just personal relationships.
Do you guys have any sense of like sort of more collaborative processes or thoughts about how that might happen?
Do you mean here at Stable or just in general?
DC, I'd say.
Yeah.
Or
Well,
Stable as a vehicle.
I think this is a good start to it. I'm really happy to be on a panel with a poet. Usually you're not on panels with interdisciplinary people. And so to have that cross-pollination happening is really interesting to me. I am a visual artist, and deep down I probably would like to be a writer. So making text-based work is like my way of being a writer and being able, to talk to Lorraine and some of the other post-studio artists who are here who are also more interdisciplinary is one reason why I applied and moved my studio here. I think it's just a matter of creating the opportunities and spaces for people to come together and see where the Venn diagram overlaps rather than where it doesn't.
Do you have anything along those lines?
Sure. So again, just adding on to what Molly has said, this opportunity to collaborate and with interdisciplinary work is, well, even though our works are very different and different medium, different disciplines, but I think through just studio visits and talking with each other, you recognize the similarities, as in terms of humor, and then the repetition and the process of creating. So that's really inspiring, just to be around people that are going through similar but different experiences or processes. And yeah, it's very, I look forward to more of this kind of exchanges and engagement.
Well,
No, I'm just
you're just holding the microphone. That's nice. I'd like to open it up a little bit to not only you guys, but make a more general question that I've been thinking about quite a bit, which is the increasingly wide accessibility of communications media and the changes that are taking place. Some of them not so good, obviously. I don't really want to dwell on that, but we could speculate a little bit. I'm going to speak for myself. I grew up in the analog period of history. I had a typewriter in my first job. It was electric though. We had a Xerox machine, and that sort of spawned all kinds of art practices with scenes and such. And now we have, basically in your computer you have a television studio, a typographic design studio. It doesn't really, I'd like to think it makes it easier, but it makes it harder in other ways. And I'd just be really interested to hear anybody that has sort of thoughts about things like that. One thing I've been researching is Twitch, the gaming platform, which is being used for a lot more than just gaming these days, politics and sort of in real life streaming. And it's a conflation of the author, I feel like, that you can be the producer, director, actor, whatever, and do whatever literally you want, as long as you come off as somewhat genuine. You're likely to get people watching you do things. I was very influenced by Marshall McLuhan, and it seems like every new piece of technology purports to be closer to what McLuhan was saying about the global village and all that. But anyway, I found the whole thing quite interesting. Do you guys want to have anything to say about that? I mean, obviously your work is influenced, or...
I have a lot to say about that.
Yeah.
One of the big questions in my work is what happens to language as it increasingly becomes digitized. And I read somewhere recently, forgive me, I forget who said this, but not since the invention of photography has there been a greater influence on artists than the internet or this digital time that we're living in. And I think a lot about that, and a lot of my work is maybe a small attempt to fight against that, but I think it's things are lost and things are gained when a new technology replaces an old technology. I had a kind of failed project about Kindles, and my first thought I read on a Kindle as well as real paper books, and a Kindle is essentially a scroll, right? You can't flip back and forth like the codex of the book, and the codex was this revolutionary technology that replaced paper scrolls, right? So in some ways the Kindle is this great new thing. You can, get a book in 10 seconds while you're at the beach or on the bus, but it's also this kind of backwards step too. So I'm really interested in that kind of gray area where, yes, it's a really great new thing, but what are you losing in that development? And we're in this moment, we're living in the moment, where we can't really know yet what is going to happen, and it's exciting to think about that, but it's also a little terrifying. And this morning I read an article about studies about what reading digitally is doing to our brains, and the science is still kind of TBD about that, but how is it actually changing neurons when you read something on a screen versus on a page. And you know, there's debates about whether that's good or bad.
Mhm. Yes, definitely. When you were talking about Kindle, like, you don't have any picture books on Kindle, do you notice? The digitization process of books cannot handle images very well. And it really wasn't until pretty recently that you could do like a direct image search in Google, you know? Like, it's much more geared towards, you know, binary letter forms. So you think, what's going to happen when we have like much greater computer? Well, everything's just going to be public, basically. And how do we feel about that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I was thinking about how, like, the internet basically proliferates the amount of public language that people have access to, or maybe it just confuses it, right? Because a lot of spaces on the internet are these quasi-public, private spaces, like all of social media, for example. And there's definitely, there's a whole body of writing and writing practices that sort of emerged in early 2000s and teens that were like collaged poems based on internet language. And actually there's a lot of work like that that's in my first book, because the language was so new and so weird, right? Like never before had I had access to communities of fans of My Little Ponies online who were also extremely like liberal and controlling conservative talk show hosts, right? That was the thing that I was really interested in for a while. So there is something strange about the form of the internet and the form of the digital where people, this is true of all technology, but it moves very fast, I think, in the digital, where people use those spaces in ways that they were not intended to be used. So, yeah, and again, like I said, I do a lot of my own writing in these public spaces, and so sometimes it's the public space of the internet a little bit. Yeah.
I just surveilled everybody. Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, well, so yesterday when we were talking, and I thought it was really interesting how you mentioned people write more and, you know, through texting.
Yeah.
And then how.
Epistolary, the age of the epistolary is here.
Yeah, and then, you know, the use of emoji. So in that sense, like, everyone was a writer and everyone was an artist. And then, so from that, my take is on how this symbiotic relationships between imagery or art and then languages, you know, the expressive power of it. I mean, personally, how you know, when I listen to audio, what I see with my mind's eye are what the words are describing. You know, I compose the narrative of the story, and then I see images of interiors and things, and then vice versa. Like when it's lost my train of thought. Well, so and then in terms of art, you know, it's not like when we incorporate text and words into our own work and make it into objects or make it into drawings, paintings, installations, and then you know, it's a different power of expressing things. You know, it's non-literal, but it's more open.
Yeah, seems like everybody's an artist now, and that's sort of what we're saying. But it's really the facility of the tools that are available to people. I feel like you guys are still are sort of able to capture sort of the mystical space of being an artist that I don't think comes across through most digital kind of memeing and all that kind of thing, which I can't even understand a lot of the memes. I mean, they're so ironic. Yeah, so I like this idea that you don't feel threatened by technology. You're still like super grounded in your practices, and that's where you're deriving your meaning in that area. So yeah, good. Why don't we open up the discussion? See if anybody else wants to join in. There you go.
Yes. Oh man,
You got it.
So I was here at the last art talk, and that talk focus a lot around like the idea of appropriation, specifically like taking like pieces from like a previous era and then appropriating it into your own work and sort of how that's now like when it's like now contemporary art. And then we talk a lot about how, you know, everything is appropriation now. Like it's just like everyone is appropriating like all the time. And then so then I was just thinking about just about each of y'all sort of modes of expression in terms of like taking words on a page and recreating them, and taking language that may not be your first language, taking that and sort of creating something to express with it, and then you taking the experiences of others in what is a public space and your experiences as well. Like you're like describing someone else's experience, so it's in some way you're appropriating like their experience in a way. What I was sort of like wondering is, do you think that like art is appropriation now? Like, have we sort of like reached an age in which contemporary art is continuously just another form of appropriation? And how do you think the sort of like culture of appropriation, not cultural appropriation, like the culture of appropriation that sort of exists today has affected the production of art within contemporary art?
Appropriation is about 100 years old now.
Yeah.
So it's been around, and it's had a huge impact. I think it pushes back against what the artist can be original about. But on the same token, there's so much more information available, resource information, and it goes beyond our scope even to even analyze it or to try to digest it. It's pretty difficult. So what was the question?
I guess I'll restate it again, but like, how do you think the like culture of appropriation that exists today like has influenced art, and do you feel like art itself, like the art that exists today or that is being produced today, is constantly, consistently are they all just appropriated? Like, you know, when you think of memes or anything that like people are creating, where they're taking things out of its original context and reproducing it in a new way, that's happening like all the time. And you say everyone is an artist, like, is that art? Like, is
I
appropriation?
think there's a much greater degree of sharing, that's possible at the same time. So, I mean, I can be critical of what's going on, but I also have to see, like, what's going to be the potential for that as we move into this sort of jungle of imagery and words.
I mean, one thing that artists and writers can do is they can do that work or look at that work or write about that work with like a critical eye. I mean, I think that I can't actually speak to the visual art world that much, but I know in the writing world that I'm a part of, there's a lot of productive angst, I think, about this particular issue because, it matters like what your subject position is, like what your background is, who are you appropriating, how do you appropriate. There's a writer that I love named Claudia Rankine, and I still remember encountering one of her books, and this was in the sort of heady days of like, yay, all the languages available on the internet, and writers were really collaging a lot of internet-based text. And again, appropriation, found text, collaging, none of these are new, but it was sort of a new source, a new, more public source. And I remember encountering her book, and every single reference was footnoted. And I remember that was like the first moment of me understanding that like, oh, there's an ethics of appropriation, right? Which is an exciting, I think, productive, but also very angsty dialogue with, the aesthetics of it, right? Like, so I see those two as being really mixed. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this addresses your question super directly, but just looking around the gallery here, there's a lot of work that you could describe as appropriation to some degree. Like I would even accept appropriation as a term for my drawings. I'm appropriating Virginia Woolf's writing and changing it into a new image and a new text, and looking around the walls, like a lot of work in the room is doing similar things. But what makes it, I think, different in art context is that art is are translating the things that they're appropriating from their individual selves. So, you know, Matt's painting with the minor fret music poster. Somebody else might be influenced by that kind of typography and culture of music posters, and then you get Go-Go Belongs Here, and they're two like very different works of art that have a similar starting point to some degree. So, I mean, that is what is kind of the most exciting thing about art to me, is that it translates someone's interior life into an object or an image or a text, or, and so as much as everyone appropriates, it's still going to end up being different and being unique because a unique person made it.
I also think that artists are tending to do things more in public space now as well, like either murals or public art of some kind. And I think that's trying to create communities, because I think the insularity of the digital culture, I mean, artists want to bring people back out into the streets and, be in connection physically. Yeah. Anybody else want to weigh in on this? Questions?
Yeah. No, I just think that
Please.
in this age, there's so much more information out there that we're kind of bombarded with imagery. And even if you think something is original, you may stumble into something that, you know, that you saw somewhere in the back of your mind. It's there, and you don't even realize you're doing it. So, but I think there's a thin line between appropriation and inspiration. Because like, even modern art was inspired by African masks and so forth. And so, you know, it's just that thin line. And I think that it's still, if you're inspired by something, then you're enamored by it, and you know, you're not doing it to be mean or anything. You're doing it because you love it, and that you know, you want to live it, and then maybe even take it somewhere else.
Put it up there. Yeah.
But to kind of tag on to that point, I agree with you 100%. But I think that thin line is also what evolves art and allows us to continue to see new mediums exist and transpire into what we once thought art was, and how to develop new forms of it too. So I think that thin line is also the nucleus that has kept art consistently evolving too. So I agree.
Oh, no, sorry.
Yeah, so it's like, I agree, it's evolving, and it's about self-awareness as well. So, you know, all these appropriation, and then I'm learning every day. It's sort of like a new idea. You know, I think it's so closely tied to race and your background, and then, you know, 98% are the same. So, race or appropriation never really, you know, entered my mind, or it wasn't really a thing. So I came here, and then I became more aware, and then, you know, once you're aware, I think you would take it more honestly or sincerely, you know, as you were saying, how in a sense, I am appropriating your language, and then trying to, but it's a journey of learning, or a journey of, you know, how I take English or the language as my source material, or as a point of inspiration, and then trying to kind of showcase how, you know, I long for it, but at the same time, you know, there are like moments, and then trying to know it better. So I think that's like appropriating it, but in a good way.
No, I wrote like next to like a comment I was thinking about you and language. I wrote like assimilation. Like, is there a connection between you know, you trying to learn English and the idea between appropriation? When I said appropriation, I wasn't like trying to say like cultural appropriation, or that it was like done like with ill intent, but just the idea of taking something out of like original context, more so than just like taking something that doesn't belong to you and making it your own sort of.
Yeah, I think, you know, there's always this curiosity that's always involved, because first, you know, you're curious, you're interested, and you want to see how you can push the limits or how you can incorporate or transform.
Yeah, I mean, just nodding along, because I think your work is actually a really good example of work that does what I was trying to think about. It's you're working across multiple languages, you're working with your own particular experience, you're wrestling with it, you're struggling with it. You create works that both to look at and then conceptually, you know, if you understand the background of them, also provoke thinking about, like, what is my relationship to language? What is my relationship to my own language? What does it mean to learn another language? What is culture? Like, how could you possibly make a dictionary of culture? Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah, there are definitely lots of reflection involved as well.
And there's a lot of movement too in language and culture. You know, it's hard to keep track of. But we have massive tools to try. Anybody else want to weigh in on anything?
I was just thinking that, you know, artists appropriate, or writers, or anyone, if they take history and appropriate it now, you know, there's so much power. It's incredible to think about who takes something that already exists, who is it written by, who built that statue, and then you reappropriate it. That's what we should be doing.
Here's what I worry about a little bit, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like history is kind of, I work with a lot of young students, and the idea of history is almost like they don't care, because if they need to know something, they can Google it or look it up, you know, so there's no context. And that's what I feel I'm trying to do with teaching, is create a context for learning. But yeah, I feel in a very profound sense, though, that because all information is virtually available, why should you do anything until you need it? Kind of thing.
I mean, I teach college, young college, I'm teaching freshmen right now, and I think making them and assigning them to physically, this is why I love your work, physically create things, such as to the picture collection yesterday in New York City, which is a collection of images I would all visit if you haven't. It's an archive, it's been there for over 100 years, and it's sort of a Google search in person. So they have to go through these images that people have touched, and there's hundreds and hundreds. And the act, the physical act, and the psychological act of doing that is a different brain process. So, yeah, it's just a whole other way of
That's a great point.
And I think as educators and artists, just having, like, remembering of the physical, using that, that mind, I don't know what the process would be, but that neurological process of research is so different, and how it affects you physically, not looking at the screen.
There's a synchronicity involved in it that's very different.
Way of entering the information. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I have a little small library, a provisions library, and one of the assignments is to take 10 books and order them by scent.
Creating the stacks is something that I do for the beginning of all of my projects for the most part, and I find that I try to translate that to my students and give them projects where they have to go into the stacks, look up an actual physical book, take it down, but part of it is also browsing the stacks near that book that you went to find and finding something else. And the physical act of doing that, of browsing, of holding the real objects, becomes part of the research process, not just the contents of the books that you're trying to find. You know, because one copy of To the Lighthouse looks different from another edition, right? So the idea of two of the same books, but they're different objects. You know, that's an important part of the work as well.
Cool.
I'm also thinking too, and I don't teach anymore, or haven't in a while, but one of the things that all students and all of us encounter at a certain point in time, if we're on the internet long enough, is like we we encounter broken links, or we encounter the fact that that thing that we saw here is no longer available. So there is materiality to the digital and to the internet, and there is this weird physicality of being on the computer and slumped over. But I think it's something that we're still coming to terms with, or at this point maybe if you're younger or Gen Z, because it is the world that we're inhabiting. The culture is literally the thing that you don't notice.
But its own history is also disappearing. This such thing as bit rot,
Yeah.
where that physical connection, the electronic circuitry breaks down, falls apart. Like things that I did in the 90s, I don't have any kind of machine that could read those big things.
Yeah, I wrote an article for the online magazine Triple Canopy a while back. And so Triple Canopy is an online magazine that was founded as a magazine that was meant to be read online. And as they built a backlog of issues, they went to an archivist and asked for advice on what's the best way for us to archive a magazine. And the archivist was like, print it out. There's still like no better way of saving things than it being on paper. Because you're right, well, links rot. Technology changes, like the new platform won't support the old website. And it's a constant evolution of how things are being presented and saved and archived.
Anybody else? There's one.
Speaking of digital technologies, I'm sort of interested in your thoughts about the original digital technology, which is the hands, or digits, and the role of the hand and the role of the body in language. And I'm particularly interested in, like in the Virginia Woolf, that you went from what was the handwritten copy to the holograph. So I'm interested to see if you looked at her handwriting, if that original sense of like what her voice would have been, because you're sort of going from hand to print back to your own hand. And so what's interesting, and then thinking of like the marginalia idea, as a woman, Virginia, like a room of one's own, but these are marginalized spaces that you're reproducing here. And so is there something there with like the gendered voice? Because once it becomes print, sort of in the sense of the body, gender sort of becomes removed from that. And I'm wondering too, same thing maybe with calligraphy, that there's, the initial sort of personality of the calligrapher in Chinese writing too, is sort of evident and speaks through. So the body leaves a trace. And so I'm wondering, what you're thinking, like as artists working with your hands, where is the trace left of language? Because you're both working in print, which is mechanically reproduced. So there's that tension of the original, the OG digital technology of the hands versus all of these other iterations.
There's a lot there, so I'm trying to decide where to start. So in terms of like the gendered space, one thing that I did and I'm doing while I make the work for this project is I'm only using, when there's a pronoun in the text, it's a female pronoun or a gender neutral, like they or their. So there's no he or his that appears in the drawings. And that is in part to, maintain the voice of Virginia Woolf, so a woman writer, and I'm rewriting these poems. I'm calling them poems, and my voice is the female pronoun. So I think though at least one over there says she. So in terms of your question about gendered space, I did consciously excise he or his or Mr. from any of the photocopies that I used in the drawings. And in terms of them being handmade, it's an incredibly important part of the work that I am going to the trouble of reproducing something that, is made by machine, by hand. And
Although she did set her own type.
Virginia Woolf she and her husband have a press, and they did set type, and she made books as a kind of hobby. She would bind books. So the idea that the hand is kind of this original piece of technology, like the drawing, even before writing was the first kind of information technology that humans used. All of that is important to me as I think about the work I make, for sure. And I spend a lot of time telling people, yes, they're drawings, because they don't, at first glance, they don't appear to be drawing, but it's really important that they are drawn. In my mind, drawing and writing are the same thing, and so the drawings are pieces of writing, and vice versa, the writings are drawings. Did that kind of get at your?
Yeah. I'm just wondering, what about her handwriting? Have you looked into
I haven't, so in the holograph draft that I'm using, there are some images of her handwritten manuscript. They're really hard to read. That's the important part of transcription, is making things readable. But I'm not making work from those images, just from the typeset version. Yeah. And just a quick aside, I was recently installing a project at my alma mater, and part of the project has handwritten forms, and the students helping me install the project could not read the cursive on the forms because they never learned to write in cursive, and they don't see it anymore. Anyway, that's alarming aside.
I could never do cursive. Oh, yes, Andy.
I was just thinking that with all the changes that are being generated by digital technology, that handmade art objects are becoming more therapeutic or more valuable, or are changing their character because they're a place to rest your eyes from all digital input. And then as artists, as we're making things by hand, it's like a place to get away from the speed, to slow down and make things by hand. And it's just that different part of your brain is used when you're making it. I think you use a different part of your brain when you're viewing it, consuming it. So it's an interesting to see how the relationship shifts, as we're consuming more and more of everyday stuff in digital form.
Yeah. What about digital artists, though?
Right. Yeah, there's that too.
What are you going to do with that?
Even with digital art, if you're a viewer, you're still your viewer in your body. I mean, you just can't get away from your body, right? Just like you can't get away from, every space is gender, and every space is, racially charged, and every space is charged with, the socioeconomic differences in the room, right? You can't get away with that. I think some art might highlight it more than others, but no matter what, you're just in there and body looking at something, having a feeling.
Yeah. I don't know, the desire for omnipotence and omniscience. I feel like that's what the internet is all about. And it's maybe a dangerous desire, like the Tower of Babel or something. Anyway, I don't think there's anything to do about it. Yeah. Okay, on that note, let's have more continued smaller conversations. Have something to drink, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Kaylee. I'm the Director of Advancement and Operations at Stable, and I want to just thank again Donald Russell, Molly Springfield, Ying Zhu, and Lorraine Graham for being a part of this conversation today. I want to acknowledge Peter Gonzalez, who's our videographer, who's donating his time and his equipment to archive discussions like this discussion today so we can share it with others. And then, of course, excuse me, Gigi Mazire, who's the friendly face at the wine table. And Gigi is also here every Saturday and Sunday from noon to 6. So if you wanted to come back and explore the exhibition when there's not a program, you're always welcome to come at any time. And then finally, I really want to acknowledge all of you for coming out today. And each and every guest here today chose to make a donation, and I think that's really big and it's something to be acknowledged. We all have tough choices sometimes about how to spend our money, and so I'm very, very appreciative of you making the choice to come here to Stable and offer a donation. While we do ask for donations at the door, it is never a requirement and we would never turn anybody away. So by you contributing today, you're helping us make sure that we never have to say no to anyone who comes, because we really want it to be great. So we are a nonprofit, but we want to make this space available for anybody who wishes to be a part of it. And I want to make a plug too for the Post Studio. So if you are an artist or a writer or somebody who wants to be a part of this community but doesn't have a need for a traditional studio space, we do have some openings in that shared working space, and I've extended the deadline, so you have until February 14th to submit an application, and you can find that on stablearts.org. So if you liked what you saw today and you enjoyed it, please come back, please tell your friends, tag us on social media at Stable Arts. I saw Mr. Reggie's and I've already reposted that, so thank you so much. But yeah, thank you all so much and enjoy the rest of your Saturday.
Thank you.